Hi, this is Dr. Annie Lowe, and I'm the director of Lamar High School's Writing Lab. And we are doing a re-record today of the SSWCA presentation, Connecting Through Conversation, by peer writing consultants Diya Gaur, Sophia Icsezen, William Ramos, and Kerah Roque. Because this is a re-recording, we won't be pausing for the audience engagement activities. So if you're watching and want to engage with us, please just press pause on the recording. I'll hand it over.
Hi, everyone. Wait. Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for attending our re-recording of our panel presentation. As you can maybe infer, we will be discussing the role of conversation in individual writing consultations, some strategies you can implement in your own sessions, and even the role of AI as secondary school writing consultants. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So hello, everyone. My name is Kerah.
My name is Diya Gaur. I'm Sophia Icsezen.
And
We are Senior Writing Lab Consultants. Okay, so these QR codes you see on your screen lead to documents that are intended to help guide y'all through our presentation. This first document is our neutral questions handout. So through our neutral questions section of our presentation, please feel free to scan the QR code or click the link, and you'll also send it out in the chat, and you'll be able to access this neutral questions handout. And then also our landing document is in the center, which leads to a link to our presentation and our various sources and various other information in case y'all are interested in learning more. And then this last QR code is to our Writing Lab website. So if y'all want to learn more about us, please feel free to click that. And so today we are going to talk about all the ways that conversation, neutral questions, and AI can be utilized in the revision process. And our key takeaways for y'all to discover how consultants can act as sounding boards to prioritize the writer's autonomy. So because this is a virtual re-recording of our initial panel, the only way that you can participate with us is by pausing your video and kind of just following along with this exercise posted on your screen.
So let's just begin by outlining what exactly are earnings. So let's start by outlining what exactly our intention with this presentation is. As writing consultants, it is our responsibility to aid writers in maintaining their autonomy over their writing. And with the increasing prevalence of new technologies, writing centers face unique challenges when it comes to helping writers maintain their autonomy. Our goal is for consultants and writers alike to learn how to navigate the new environment through the use of neutral questions and mindful AI use.
Okay, so this is the first section of our presentation, conversation and neutral questions. And we're going to start off by discussing how you can use conversational tactics in order to guide a writer through the revision process. And then we're going to talk about neutral questions as a tool within conversation. Okay, so our initial issue, something that we really like to use our platform to emphasize, is the significance of revision in the writing process. So while all stages of writing are essential to the final product, revision is the area in which the writer can sometimes lose their initial autonomy and ownership of their writing. When making decisions on what to keep, what to revise, what style of writing, what kind of voice, you're able to truly define your piece. If a writer comes into a writing center hoping for help revising, it is essential that you, as a consultant, do not impress your opinions on revision upon them. But how is this even possible? How can you provide constructive feedback without taking over the writer's piece? Well, we have found that by exercising certain conversational tactics, we are able to effectively guide our writers through the revision process while maintaining their autonomy.
So let's start by zooming out and identify exactly how this problem occurs. If you think about the last time you really revised your piece, beyond just fixing typos or rewording sentences, you'll notice it mostly happens mentally. How many times did you get stuck rereading the same sentence over and over again, knowing something goes off, not quite knowing why? This common struggle stems from writing
Thinking made concrete. And this is where conversation steps in as a necessary tool for revision. When it comes to revision, writing consultants must prioritize engaging the writer in presenting, clarifying, and rethinking their ideas, rather than just obsessing over minor inconsistencies in the paper. So, what is the role of conversation? At first glance, the connection might not seem super obvious. After all, don't we write independently? Well, the truth is that writing is deeply social, and writers are constantly in conversation with their readers. Every time we write, we make choices about what to say and how to say it based on an imaginary audience. However, the audience only exists in our head and mostly agrees with our decisions. Real conversation shifts that through externalizing thought. When a writer audibly explains their ideas, they are forced to move beyond what feels clear to what actually is clear. They hear the gaps in their own thinking and get immediate feedback on what to rework. Conversation eases the refinement and the development ideas instead of just telling writers what to do or what's unclear, which is what we should try to guide in these moments of realization. So, another big obstacle to effective revision is the illusion of clarity. When we read our own work, we already know what we meant to say, making it really difficult to recognize when something isn't as clear as we think. Conversation acts as a kind of mirror that reflects the writer's ideas back to them in a new way. When you ask, "What do you mean by this?" the writer has to confront their assumptions and omissions, gauging the dissonance between intention and interpretation. But it's important to remember that this isn't about catching mistakes. It's about letting the writer discover where to redirect attention through another lens. Finally, through inquiry, conversation shifts revision into truly rethinking ideas. Revision isn't just about making a draft better in some objective sense. It's about developing the writer's ability to engage critically with their own work. If writers see revision as just correcting mistakes, they'll focus on surface level changes while the underlying ideas remain the same. When they see revision as an opportunity to refine their thinking, they'll engage with their work in a much deeper way. This is why conversation is central in shifting this mindset, because through discussion, we show that the best writing doesn't emerge fully formed, but involves through dialogue, reflection, and revision. So, our audience engagement for this slide is that we want to hear how you connect the conversation in your own sessions. Think about some workshops that you've done, or just a consultant that came in and then you had to implement some strategies to enable them to revise their own ideas, and how you felt yourself being involved in the process. Now, the next important piece of revision is the clear communication aspect. Clarity isn't just about what we mean to say, it's about how well that meaning is conveyed. Well, the first thing you want to accept when dealing with clarity is that it is not natural, it's developed. A writer might not realize a sentence is confusing until they hear someone else struggle to interpret it. Similarly, a consultant might not immediately know why something feels unclear, but through conversation, both can identify the source. So, what gets in the way of clear communication? Here are just four of the main obstacles that we've identified. The first is overcomplication, which is writers often think good writing means using complex words and long sentences, when in reality, simplicity is key. This means that a strong argument should be clear even when explained informally or casually. The second is unfocused ideas. If a writer hasn't fully developed their argument, their writing will reflect that confusion. This is why a lack of clarity in thought leads to a lack of clarity in writing. The third is assumed knowledge. Writers sometimes assume readers know what they know, but if they make logical gaps, their argument can feel incomplete or difficult to follow. And finally, having a disconnected structure. Even if individual sentences make sense, if the overall organization is unclear, the reader would struggle to follow along. Transitions, paragraph structure, and logical flow all contribute to clarity. Okay, so now that we understand why something feels unclear, how exactly do consultants help? I would say it's by guiding them through revision in a way that makes clarity a natural outcome of their own thinking. There are a couple ways you can do this, and here are just four of the main ones we have identified. The first is to ask for summaries. If a writer struggles to explain their to you, that's a sign the idea isn't fully developed. Asking, can you sum this up in a few words, forces them to distill their arguments into the main ideas. Secondly, rephrase and reflect their thoughts. Sometimes hearing their own ideas in a different form helps the writer recognize gaps in clarity. Saying, so what I'm hearing is dot dot dot, and restating their argument helps refine their thinking. Thirdly, you can also challenge assumptions. Asking, how do you know this when something feels vague, pushes the writer to clarify and support their reasoning beyond mere assertions. Finally, you can leverage your position as a reader to explore, probe, and question. Encouraging writers to consider how a reader might interpret their work helps them shift from what makes sense to them to what will make sense to others. So, the most important thing to remember is that clarity through revision is an active process, and people learn at different rates. Our audience engagement for this part is, can you think of a time, whether in your own writing or within a session, where ideas felt unclear and how you approached this obstacle? Since this is a virtual meeting, you can pause here and write down your response. Next, it's important to talk about relinquishing control in a session. Now, I'll be the first to admit that sometimes we feel an unspoken pressure to fix things. If we can see the problem, why not just give the answer? Well, when we take control of the revision process, we heard its real purpose of helping the writer develop the skills and confidence to refine their work autonomously. Imposing changes or leading too forcefully may create a better piece, but it won't create a better writer. Instead of telling writers what's wrong or how to fix something, we should guide them toward recognizing those issues themselves. So, how do we shift our approach from giving solutions to guiding discovery without overstepping boundaries? Well, the simplest but trickiest way is by asking the right kinds of questions. Open-ended, reflective questions force writers to slow down, articulate their thinking, and take ownership of their choices. But listening is equally essential. Understanding their meaning, tone, and context helps make out what to prioritize and the right approach to use. But not every writer benefits from the same type of conversation, meaning we have to find the right balance. Try to provide pointed questions when a starting point is needed, but slow down for writers who need to think things through and develop confidence in their own abilities. Still, some writers expect us to do all the hard work for them, but doing so distances personal engagement. Confronting uncertainty and working through challenges is necessary for learning, which is why giving them time to think through it on their own before speaking up is better in the long run. Ultimately, our goal is to develop writers who can revise effectively on their own. If every session ends with the writer depending on us to clarify their ideas, we haven't fully helped them. But if they leave with a clear sense of how to identify and solve problems on their own, everyone wins. When we relinquish control and empower writers to take charge of their own revisions, we expedite their ability to think, communicate, and revise beyond a single session. But what types of questions and conversational techniques are most effective? And how can we adapt conversational revision to different writing needs and student personalities? Don't worry, we have a whole section on that and the effect of our environment on how we connect through conversation.
Okay, so thank you, William. So this section is primarily adding on to what we learned previously, but here our key emphasis is that the writer is the person who you want to control and lead the writing process as compared to using the writing consultant. And so here we want to start with the foundation of everything we do as writing consultants. We really believe that writers should always remain in control of their own work. And truly, no one knows their own thoughts or intentions and voice better than they do. So that means our role as writing consultants is not to take over that writing process, but to guide them towards a more deeper understanding of their writing. And so in our writing lab, when a writer usually comes to us, they're not really looking for the quick fixes like in grammar or spelling and capitalization, so on. Maybe sometimes they do, but in that you might want to help guide them with that. But the majority of the time, the writers that are coming to us, they're looking for a lot of clarity and direction and confirmation that their ideas make sense outside of their own head. And so a lot of the times it's easy to assume that a consultant's job is to correct mistakes, but that's not really what we're here for. Instead, we're trying to identify the areas of strength and the areas that need further development in their writing. And so we want them to recognize the patterns in their own work. So, one of the most effective ways is to do this through conversation. When we really ask writers to reflect on their own writing, whether through rephrasing or the questioning or really just prompting them to explain their choices out loud, we're more so asking them to actively engage in the revision process rather than passively receiving feedback. This is really, at the end of the day, what fosters the real improvement that we see within both the writer and their writing. And so, we don't want to just see this improvement in a single piece of paper, but really the way that they approach writing as a whole. And so, one thing just to keep in mind is that revision is not fixing mistakes. During the revision process, we always aim to really rework, refine, and strengthen the writer's ideas. And so, because writing is a living process and it's something that's constantly evolving, we really want to treat revision as an act of, you know, growth rather than failure, where if we discourage writers from embracing the changes that make their work stronger. So, like, really, instead, what you could do is have a goal to create a space where revision is seen as an essential part of writing, where it's more expected, welcome, and even enjoyed. So, it's really easy to kind of keep revision as one of those very tedious tasks, but that's what you want to stray away from. And so, really, when it comes to being a writing consultant, we really want to approach our role as something that's more than just helping someone improve a single assignment. And so, as consultants, we want to empower writers to develop confidence and independence in both their writing and the writing process. And so, to do that effectively, we really need to stay true to a couple of core principles. So, our first strategy is to avoid making direct edits into their work. Writers often need like the guidance and adjustments to recognize what is effective in their work and what may not be. And so for us as consultants, it might be really tempting to just go in, jump into the writing and reword a sentence just to improve clarity in it, or maybe fix a very minor grammatical issue on the spot. But really, what this is doing is taking ownership away from their writer. And so, what we want to ensure is that we're keeping the writer's voice in place and we're avoiding plagiarism. And so, another strategy which you could use is asking questions which really think the writer to rethink and revise on their own terms. This will be further elaborated on a bit more in Sophia's section, but if a sentence which you find unclear like comes up is, you know, not really doing it for you, what you can ask is that maybe something which is along the lines of, oh, what exactly are you trying to communicate here? Or maybe could you rephrase this sentence in another way? And so, also just don't be afraid to provide critical feedback here. Affirming language is one of those really big things which we see in the writing lab that keeps our writers engaged. And so there's some really simple phrases which you can use, like, oh, that's a really great point. Why don't you write that down? Or maybe, oh, make note of that so you remember it later, which kind of keeps the writer grounded in the writing process rather than primarily relying on the consultant to dictate any changes in their work. And so, what we see from this approach is that it really reinforces the fact that writing is a very iterative process and the writer is supposed to be the primary decision maker. And so, also, when you rephrase those ideas, like you're bouncing back these ideas which the writer has come up with, this really allows the writer to hear their thoughts in a new perspective. And at the end of this day, what this is doing is really encouraging deeper engagement with the writer's writing. And so you want to reinforce that fact that like the writer's thoughts and reflections are very valuable while also encouraging that active position so they're staying grounded within what's going on in your session. And so, really, what you want to emphasize here is that you're giving very honest and thoughtful feedback. You want the writer to feel valued in their position and very open to all of the commentary which you're giving them. So, you want to be supportive and actionable. And so, like, some phrases that you can use here is that, oh, this isn't work. Instead of saying this isn't working, try something which is like, oh, I see what you're going for here. But I think the argument would be even stronger if you added something else. And so, really, just take those steps, which are more so like empathetic towards the writer. For for writers especially, it's kind of difficult to navigate the writing process, and as consultants who have a bit more knowledge about writing, what exactly we want to do is, carefully and very lovingly share our knowledge with them. And so you might hear this phrase a lot, but the goal here isn't simply to improve a single piece of writing, but to help writers develop lasting skills which they can also apply to future work and themselves. Yeah. Okay. So examples of constructive feedback here, these are just like a couple of ways that you can approach the constructive feedback. I know sometimes it can be really hard to really formulate it on the spot, but here these sentences and phrases will help you kind of improve that, you know, take a step back from the process, view it objectively, and kind of put the writer in a position where they're still open to feedback and commentary. And so you really want to be able to create that balance between encouragement and constructive criticism instead of really just praising or pointing out flaws only. You want to frame feedback in a way that challenges the writer to improve. And so, these sentences here are for that. And so if you struggle with this, I would also recommend Liz Lerman's critical response process. Sophia will also elaborate a bit further on this, but this can also be found in our landing document with all of our links. Okay, so this is the big question. Can our environment shape conversation? The answer to this, absolutely. Okay, so the setting of a writing consultation really directly impacts the way that a conversation unfolds. Everything from the physical space to the atmosphere can create, like, it affects how we really do our interactions and really influences how the writer engages with feedback. So, why does environment matter? So, the environment is really big, like when it comes to just psychology, like how you really open up yourself to feedback and so on. And so when you have a comfortable and open setting, you encourage dialogue, whereas in a rigid or intimidating one, you can easily shut it down. And so a writing center should be or feel like a very collaborative space and not like a correctional facility. And so the way we position ourselves physically can affect the dynamic of a session. And so there are a couple of best practices which you can use here for a very effective consultation environment. And one of them is sitting on the writer's non-dominant hand side. And so really this is a very subtle shift, but it naturally positions the writer to take notes and make those revisions and further engage with their work instead of passively just waiting for the feedback. And like we said on one of the previous slides, we also want to make sure that the writer is grounded in the writing process. And so, really, also while you're making these considerations for the writer, you also want to remember that you want to be able to respect both yours and the writer's personal and psychological boundaries. And so, this is something that gets overlooked, but not every conversation in the writing lab will be comfortable, and that's something that's okay. If a topic makes you feel uncomfortable or goes beyond the scope of writing, just know it's fine to redirect the conversation or say, I'm not comfortable with discussing that. Just being upfront here is key, but just make sure you're also keeping the focus on writing rather than personal opinions. If a writer's argument is very well supported, but you personally disagree, just remember that your role is to help with the clarity and structure and not necessarily to debate. And really, the key that you want to focus on is not accusing the writer of anything in particular. And so, this can be hard, but as your role as a writing consultant or a tutor, you want to be able to maintain that professional but open approach that really ensures that the session remains very focused and productive and respectful of each other. And so, also, it's okay if you don't know how to do something. Organic ideas are so hard. Don't be afraid to ask for help as the writing consultant. You can always go to, the bigger person who's overseeing your organization. And so that's something I found that's helped me a lot in the past. And so, yeah, just be objective, don't judge, and don't sacrifice your integrity for something that's unethical. You want to avoid plagiarism at all costs. And, that's something that's not emphasized enough for consultants as well. And at the end of the day, having a positive revision environment isn't more so about this physical space, but also about like the trust and collaboration that we build with the writers. When writers feel safe, respected, and valued, they're more willing to engage deeply with the revision process. So this is not what we want to see in the writing lab. This is a couple of examples of, two people getting angry at each other. Just keep in mind, this is not a debate. Yes. You don't want to be him. So, why should we establish boundaries? Another great question, guys. So, boundaries aren't just about setting limits, they're about creating a structure that fosters both independence and growth. And without boundaries, writing consultations can easily become very one sided, where the consultant takes over the writing process instead of empowering the writer to do it like on their own independently. And so the importance of boundaries is that one, they preserve the writer's autonomy and voice. And when writers walk away from a session, they don't want to feel like the work is not their own. They want to feel like the work is their own, but it's not been rewritten for them completely. And so here, our job is to support and not take control. One thing to keep in mind. And so, really, when we take this approach, we help the writers develop confidence and independence in their writing. And this is something that I can't emphasize enough. But the goal of a writing center isn't just to improve one paper. We want to equip the writers with skills that they can carry forward in their careers. And so, if we have the writers become too reliant on the consultants, they won't build the confidence to revise on their own. And so, really, at the end of this day, where this is like taking the writer to is higher education, like teamwork and life skills. And so, learning how to give and receive feedback is very crucial in the academic and professional world. And writing centers at the end of the day really are not about better essays. They're more so about developing better thinkers and communicators and collaborators. So, you might also ask, well, what happens without boundaries? And to that, I say writers may really expect consultants to fix their work instead of engaging with their ideas. They might lack confidence in their ability to revise independently. And at the very end, it starts losing its collaborative nature and it starts to become more of a tutoring session than a discussion with a writer over a piece of work or their own writing. And so the best way to establish boundaries is through clear and effective communication. You can start your sessions by setting expectations. Like, for example, you could say, I won't be making direct edits to your work, but I'll help you identify areas that might need some work. And so having this approach really ensures that both the writer and the consultant understand their roles from the beginning. Okay, so in summary, our goal is to not perfect the writer's piece, but to develop their understanding of writing. We act as a sounding board and help the writers think critically about their own work. And by fostering these skills, we empower writers to grow not just as students, but also independent thinkers. So here are a couple of food for thought questions. And so, how do you feel that you've explored the role of conversation within your own session? Do you enjoy more talkative or quiet writers, and why?
Okay, so feel free to pause and answer those, but we're going to move on because this is a re-record. So thank you, Dia, and thank you, Will. Um, and now my question is, but are there any tools to specifically shape conversations in order to preserve writer autonomy? Yes, neutral questions. And that's what we're going to be talking about. Yay. Okay, so what is a neutral question? Those of you not familiar with writing theory might not know exactly what defines a neutral question, but have no fear. Neutral questions are questions posed in a deliberately passive manner in an attempt to help the writer through the critical thinking process. Liz Lerman is an American choreographer that wrote a book on the workshopping process, applicable to writing as well as dance, and she focused on the idea of unbiased feedback. This book is called The Creative Response Process, which Diya mentioned, and in it, Lerman articulated the concept of neutral questions as we use them in our own writing center. In order to successfully use neutral questions, we must remember that as writing consultants, it is our responsibility to help steer the writer through the writing process without forcing our own opinions on them. When we talk about revision in particular, however, we must acknowledge the delicate nature of the relationship between writer and consultant and the ways that our questions can sometimes be taken as an order rather than helpful feedback. Oops. Okay, so how do you actually use neutral questions if they're so important? Well, neutral questions are just another tool available to a writing consultant. We tend to use them when the writer is either brainstorming or revising because neutral questions are an excellent way to stimulate a current idea or help determine what is most necessary to keep in order to preserve the meaning of the piece. We must use neutral questions to target the section of the writing that the writer wants to focus on, ensuring that we are able to give effective feedback while maintaining the writer's ownership. As Liz Lerman says, when defensiveness starts, learning stops. As such, it's essential to make sure that all of our questions are fueled by curiosity and genuine interest. If the writer perceives a question you ask as deliberately targeting or too critical of their writing, then it is likely that they will stop responding effectively and will end up not taking anything of substance from their meeting. This is the worst possible situation and the very reason why we use neutral questions. Okay, so here are a few examples of effective neutral questions versus biased questions. So I'm going to kind of read and compare them. Firstly, am I supposed to believe that the characters you are playing are mortal enemies? Versus, what is the relationship you want to portray between these characters? As we can see in this first question, there's a clear bias posed. As a consultant, it seems like we are not convinced by the relationship we presume to be posed by the writer. This puts the writer on defense because they feel like their work is being directly attacked. In contrast, our second question is a wonderful alternative because we can prod the writer into thinking about the relationship between two characters without sharing our own opinion about how we interpret their relationship. The writer is much more likely to respond to this question, and they may articulate an idea that helps you with their revision. For example, shaping their writing to show this idea they are interested in portraying. Our second example of neutral versus biased questions are the following. Why is your poetry so angry? Versus talk about the role of emotion in your poetry. Now, in the first question, it is once again a direct criticism of the writer and therefore puts them on the defensive. The language seems outwardly critical and very aggressive to a writer. This will absolutely result in defensiveness and could shut down all effective conversation. Now, the second question may sound more like a statement, but it plays the same role of a question as it asks the writer to think more about the specific emotional choices that they made throughout their writing. As Liz Lerman says, rather than a negative opinion prompting a retort or a shutdown, neutral inquiry draws out knowledge that informs, alters, or surgically narrows the focus of the responder's opinion to prepare it for sharing in step 4. This is what we must always keep in mind when asking neutral questions. The ultimate goal is to help the writer better understand themselves and the goals they have for their individual work. Now that we know what a neutral question is and a few examples of how they can effectively be used, we must investigate how to best use neutral questions in the writing center. It is often the case that the writer brings in a piece that they have no idea how to begin to edit. This can often feel very difficult to you as a consultant because you do not necessarily know how to guide the writer. Neutral questions are the method that we use to stimulate the writer to begin thinking about what exactly they are proud of and what exactly they think they could work on. You, as a consultant, can ask the writer what they would like to discuss, and from there, you can target a specific section of this piece using tailored neutral questions. You must tailor your neutral questions to this piece of work shown to you. Not all neutral questions can be used in the same context, so you must build the ability to select which neutral questions would be most helpful in the writer's revision process. But that brings us to the big question. How do you build effective neutral questions? Okay, let's start off with this guiding Liz Lerman quote. Responders' queries may be motivated by unbiased curiosity or by a strong opinion that informs but is not exposed by the question. This is a very important point for you as a consultant to acknowledge. You must allow your own curiosity to fuel your questions without imbuing your own opinion on the writer in question. However, the writer can also tell when you are asking questions without any genuine interest. So try to form your questions with interest in their work and in helping the writer through their process. These are a few neutral questions that I have constructed. What particularly in this piece do you feel most confident about? What would you like this piece to say about you to its reader? These questions bring the writer into a reflective state of mind that is essential for any revision process. We have also found that when a writer asks for specific feedback, neutral questions can also be used to help guide them from thinking about an end goal to their own writing process. One example we've used frequently is, I felt like the use of X really enhanced the meaning for me. Perhaps you could also apply this strategy in Y. This specific question is a really good template for consultants who are fielding a writer that wants specific feedback on their grammar or writing style. We must not actually touch or write on their piece, so by asking these kinds of questions, we are pointing out a strength of their writing and suggesting using it in a different place in order to enhance the meaning they want to get from that particular section. We are allowing the writer to make their own choices while providing them the feedback that they requested from us. Okay, so before we actually start using neutral questions in our meetings, it's important that you start practicing how to form questions on your own. So this is a recorded version of the presentation. So please feel free to pause after I explain kind of what's going on and form your own neutral questions. So if you're not sure where to start, basically you can scan this QR code and it takes you to the neutral questions handout that I've created that gives you a couple suggested neutral questions depending on a situation when you have a writer in a writing lab. And there are a couple scenarios down towards the bottom of the slide. So if you need a scenario to form a neutral question because you can't just come up with a random one off the top of your head, please feel free to think about when someone comes in to revise a college essay, or they want to come in to have revision on a piece of creative writing or a resume. And please feel free to take any of these suggestions. And if you want to make your own or just form random neutral questions, that's great too. So you can pause here. Okay, wrapping up neutral questions. Overall, we believe that the use of neutral questions is the first method that we as writing consultants can use to begin helping a writer better understand how it is they can review and revise a piece. Neutral questions are an opportunity to help stimulate thoughts that may not have been there before and help guide the reader into studying their writing in a way they may never have before. I hope that you now feel confident in your ability to use neutral questions in a session and your ability to form neutral questions in different situations. So this slide would be used for questions, but we also want to pose the questions. Have you used neutral questions before? Have you heard of Liz Lerman? And please feel free to take a moment, pause, and think about this right now. Yeah, and that's on this slide right now. And now we're going to move on.
Society has become increasingly intertwined with technology, and this can especially be seen with many novice writers bringing in AI-written pieces of work into these individual writing consultations. This is not meant to be something to be stopped completely, especially considering the nature of a lot of the writers we may see in specifically the high school scene. But as consultants, we should aim for smarter use of these technologies. Rather than discourage their use from the start, we should learn how to work with this technology rather than against. But in order to learn this new skill, we must first understand why these writers feel inclined to use these technologies. So Why AI? Novice writers often turn to AI when unsure of where to begin their assignment or writing piece, which directly transfers the ownership of their writing to the program instead. AI then becomes responsible for the creation of this piece, a responsibility that should belong to the writer. This transfer of ownership can look like prompting the chatbot to create a thesis statement, which then makes the main ideas of the writing piece correspond to this artificial intelligence rather than the writer, or asking the chatbot to write a specific section or the entire piece of writing, therefore transferring the entire ownership of this section or of the entire writing to this artificial intelligence. There's often a distinct quality to these pieces that does not match the tone of the assignment or student, and when asked, the student often states that they used artificial intelligence because they had an idea and simply did not know how to word it properly. This distinct quality is especially seen in the voice of the writer, considering that voice in comparison to how the student actually communicates verbally or in other academic settings, because the voice of this writing is actually the voice of the artificial intelligence, often coming across as overly formal or unfamiliar with the topic at hand, which would not be the case if the student was organically coming up with these ideas themselves. So how do we make the switch? Through conversation and neutral questions. Peer writing consultants can prompt the writer to think about the strengths of their piece, then build on these strengths to build a stronger original piece of work. In conversation, talking about the piece presented without blatantly accusing the writer of using artificial intelligence. The writer can often reveal their true intentions or reasoning in using AI. Most writing consultations start with a simple conversation before the writer presents their writing. Establishing this relationship from the start can make it easier for the writer to feel comfortable discussing their work and their intentions behind their work. With neutral questions. Neutral questions help both the writer and the consultant assess the strengths and weaknesses of the paper and organically build on these ideas through conversation. Many of the questions introduced in the beginning of the presentation can also be applied with AI written work. We will also explore some AI specific neutral questions. Tackling AI in conversation. When a session begins, it typically follows this structure. The writer walks in, the consultant greets the writer, and they sit. The consultant begins asking the writer about the content of the work, and the writer presents their work. There is nothing inherently wrong with this structure, but it does often create a gap between the writer and the consultant. Asking the writer about how they're doing, how they feel about their work, rather than jumping in to feedback from the start, can help the writer and the consultant build a much stronger relationship from the beginning of that consultation. This type of conversation also establishes that this consultation is about the writer and not the consultant. Think of it like forming a friendship, because not only can establishing this relationship help the writer feel more comfortable sharing their writing, it can also help them trust you with future assignments as well. This is especially important with personal creative writing and college essays, something I have especially seen in my own sessions. Tackling AI with neutral questions. In these conversations, we are also able to tackle artificial intelligence without putting the writer on the spot. The consultant can use neutral questions to prompt the writer to identify the strengths and weaknesses of their piece, even if it was written in conjunction with artificial intelligence, like looking at a specific paragraph and asking them to identify the topic sentence, then considering whether the writer likes the topic through this use of neutral questions. Some example questions of how to get to this part of the consultation is, which sentence stands out to you the most, or what does this sentence make you think of? The consultant can then help the writer organically build off that topic and create an outline for original writing. In this instance, AI is used to create the outline through working rough draft, and through revision, the consultant can have a working conversation with the writer to add organic thought to the strengths of this piece. Here's an example of a piece of AI written writing meant for one of the student publications at my school, our yearbook, with the purpose of spotlighting a specific class. This writing was flagged by another student who also happened to be a peer writing consultant in our own writing center, but rather than directly call out this student and risk any trust this student and the peer writing consultant may have, we decided to instead workshop this writing and use some of the strategies we have just previously outlined. The first step toward original writing in this scenario is to pull out what the student feels is the strongest from the artificial intelligence written writing, which is seen here. So I'm going to focus on specifically the topics, the first sentence of this paragraph, because often in consultations, that is where we start in our writing. The engineering class is an opportunity for setting students' careers in the future. Like I said, one of the main standout sentences a lot of consultations often focus on are those beginning introduction paragraphs, because this is a large area where many novice writers and many established writers as well seem to struggle. I picked this sentence because it doesn't necessarily sound like a student would say this. It doesn't have the natural voice and flow that a student may use in verbal conversation. So through revision and using verbal communication and conversation outlined in the slides previous in that specific consultation, we ended up with a more revised example. So again, the topic sentence, the first sentence instead becomes, the engineering class is an opportunity to set students' future careers. What do you notice is different about this sentence? It sounds like a student would say it. This sentence has fluidity and individuality that the first draft did not have, which is especially important considering the context of this writing, of this example, because it was student-written work meant for a student publication. So it is especially important to make sure that fluidity and individuality of the student comes through in their own writing. Now you try. On this slide, we see an example of a paragraph written for a philosophy assignment using Microsoft Copilot. Because Copilot uses online sources that a student would most likely use, it can be especially useful to work with your writer to identify those clear ideas and build on them organically, because it is very likely you can then work with your writer to find these sources and build on them after synthesizing them and understanding the information they are presenting. So of course, you can go ahead and pause the video, take a few minutes to read the paragraph, identify some sentences you feel can be workshopped. And we can just take a couple of minutes to do that. Okay. So AI for idea generation. Writers often use AI as a thesis statement or main idea generator. This is especially prevalent in assignments for classes with a heavy writing emphasis, such as philosophy or English. Students ask ChatGPT to write a thesis statement based on the assignment and their own knowledge, and consultants can help writers workshop the AI-generated statement to use knowledge the student already has from the course. This maintains both the original intentions of the writer and also gains critical thinking and writing skills for the student, the original intention of the assignment. Next, we'll see an example of an interaction with ChatGPT for this purpose. So here we can see me, a student, interacting with ChatGPT. One of the ways a consultant can mediate a writer's autonomy when using AI since the beginning of this process is considering what the writer prompted ChatGPT to do. So here we can see in my example, I specifically said, I really like the use of figurative language to depict tragedy in Hamlet. Could you help me write a thesis statement based on this? This is especially seen because I am putting my own personal knowledge into this technology, the use of figurative language and how it's used to depict tragedy. That is something that came organically from my own thought. Now, not all students use AI the same, but through conversation, the consultant can help their writers get to this point. Once ChatGPT provides an answer, the conversation can then continue between the writer and the consultant, where the consultant then helps the writer build off this statement organically, both maintaining the teacher's original intention of critical thinking within the assignment and maintaining what the writer already knows about the topic at the core of the assignment. From this, neutral questions, like the ones we spoke of earlier, can be used in the consultation to steer this writer towards organic writing. ChatGPT is not real analysis. It cannot critically evaluate like humans can. It just follows all of the formulas and lines of codes it is given. So, does it work? Yes, a study was conducted in a college-level setting that prompted students to use ChatGPT to write an academic paper, resume, or cover letter. The results showed that artificial intelligence was useful in idea generation, as we previously mentioned, grammar, and template creation, but fell short in natural flow, critical thinking, and creativity. This can be easily translated into use at the high school level as well. Although this study was exclusive to college students, because it was exclusive to many college students, many of the participants used a resume or cover letter as their specific piece of writing. This can easily reap the same benefits when used at this high school level, though, especially considering seniors creating their first post-high school materials. Many of the students that come through our writing lab are seniors, bringing in these same post-high school materials, such as their resume, which they will be using for either college applications or job applications. By establishing strategies to mitigate the use of artificial intelligence since high school, students will graduate with these skills and continue to use them in their higher education as well. Although AI fell short in natural flow, critical thinking, and creativity, this gap can be bridged with the help of the consultant, using those neutral questions we mentioned earlier. Feel free to refer to the handout in our landing document and those QR codes we first put in the beginning of the presentation to brainstorm some possible neutral questions to be used. In creating this presentation, I also began to consider what specific neutral questions can be made specifically tailored to these post-high school materials and to specific AI-written pieces of work. But because the focus is on ending with a better writer instead of better writing, it is important to consider the actual context of the writing and what the writer is aiming to communicate, not necessarily focusing on the fact that this was written by artificial intelligence or this is a very standard piece of writing because it's something like a resume or a cover letter. So again, if anyone has any questions, we also have some food for thought for you to consider at this point in the presentation. How have you seen the use of AI become more or less prevalent in your own sessions? And do you feel like this has aided or hurt your own writing? So again, if you want to take a moment, pause the video and go ahead and reflect on these things.
Please feel free to scan this QR code and give us feedback. We would love to know what y'all think about our presentation. And yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm gonna come back. Right. Thank you to our panelists. That was such a thorough illumination from William about Siri-backed advice for supporting clarity and relinquishing control in practice to encourage student autonomy, writer autonomy. Diya on revision best practices that are values aligned with encouraging the writer to retain their autonomy as well, and thinking about all of those different dimensions from affirming their process to the environment and the boundaries. Sophia on neutral questions as a critical response process strategy that helps the writer refine their ideas and develop a rhetorical sensibility. And finally, Kerah in the Writing Center with AI, seeing AI generated text as a tool or a step in the process rather than the end of the conversation. So thank you all very much. We appreciate your time, and we'll go ahead and close.